Welcome, everybody. I am Kurt Guyar, the Managing Director at the Center of the American West. It's a pleasure to have you here for our fifth, but not final, Historians Imagine event, but the final in this series. We are actually meeting in about a week and a half to discuss the future of this program, and we're excited. This has been a fantastic program. We anticipate that it will be ongoing. So just basically stay tuned to the center. You'll be hearing communications about this program and others coming up in the fall. But this is the last for this school year for us. This series is a monthly webinar that features conversations with path-breaking historians about their inventiveness and vision of their work. We are recording this webinar, so you can come to this Center of the American West website in about a week's time, and it will be there. It's also, as I mentioned before, streaming live on Facebook. A couple pieces, well, first of all, Patty already did this, but a big shout out to Kate Carpenter for coming to us and asking us to do this series. Patty and Matt participated in a conversation on the role of creativity in historical work at the WHA last fall. It's hard to imagine, this was just last October. And Kate asked, well, will you keep doing that? And that one question basically pushed us to suggest, yes, we will keep doing that. And it has been a fantastic series as a result. So thank you, Kate. I'd also like to thank Brian Bishop from the University of Colorado, who helps us with all the tech back end. Lisa Cooper, who is also assisting there and has been a big part of arrangements for this. Honey Aschenbrenner, our marketing communications person. Valerie Albicker, who also has been key in helping us. And anybody who I've accidentally left off, I'm sorry. The students that work at the center, we have fantastic students who do all the editing on this recording and been quite supportive for all of this. So thank you to all of them. Just a couple pieces of housekeeping. The first is this event happens in two parts. We have the first hour is a conversation with Matt and Patty and Natalia. And then after that hour, we will adjourn to a Zoom room that is more like an open conversation where people can ask questions directly. We'll collect Q&A in the Q&A chat. But if you go to the Q&A chat, there is a question, what is the link for the post-event Q&A session? And you'll see that link there. So at 1 o'clock, you can click on that link. I'll be in that room waiting for you. So you can come join us there. And the other piece of housekeeping is that we have a program that we'd like to tell you about. It's a little sort of side program, but not completely unrelated. So I'm going to turn it over to Patty to tell them about our Rosenbloom Scholar Program.
Okay. Well, thank you, Kurt. Thank you to all of our attendees, and do stay in touch so that you can find out when we get this started again. But I want to take just really a minute to say that we have, at City of American West, thanks to two fine donors, the Rosenblooms, we have a thing called the Rosenbloom Scholars Program, and it is open for applications now. It's kind of a complement or sideline to our Mellon Foundation program, not really much of a side, I mean, in itself, but this is our program where if you would like to know more, if you are a graduate student and you would like to know more about what public audiences would benefit from knowing your research findings and receive a $350 stipend, here is the application deadline is June 15th, 2021. The Rosenbloom Scholars offers, if you become one of those, you work with me, you give me your prospectus. Basically, I read your prospectus and we get to a wild brainstorming session about who needs to know about your work, either now or in the future, and your applied history skills get cultivated. And then we'll have a panel at the Western History Association where we will talk about what came of these encounters and experiences. So there it is. And there's information available soon here. Well, it's right there to write us mellon@centerwest.org and get an application June 15th, not that far away, but it's not that long an application, so it should work. Okay, that'll do it for the announcement. And now, oh boy, we are so fortunate that Natalia Molina accepted our invitation very fast after we gave it to her when we worked on our scheduling, and here she is. And she's an undergraduate at UCLA, has her advanced degrees, PhD from University of Michigan. She is now, if I don't get this right, she is currently distinguished professor in the Department of American Studies and Ethnicity at the University of Southern California. She was at UC San Diego for many years. She is a MacArthur Fellow, which I apparently thought was so important that I put it twice on my little sheet here. So maybe they extend the term for 5 years if I type it twice. Maybe it could be very positive as an experience there. She is the author of several books: How Race is Made in America, Immigration, Citizenship, and the Historical Power of Racial Scripts, and Fit to be Citizens, Public Health and Race in Los Angeles, 1879 to 1940, and co-editor of Relational Formations of Race, Theory, Method, and Practice. And having had the chance to spend quality time with her books, I ended up just thinking, do you ever just yearn to write about something that's not intensely relevant? Do you ever don't answer that just yet here, but do you ever just think maybe you could write on something of just minor, arcane, antiquarian interest? And people would say, well, they might say, well, what happened to her? But they would understand that you just wanted a little restful interlude. It seems like that's not going to happen, but the books are so full of illumination about the past and so intensely valuable for helping us navigate in the present. So it's really a pleasure to have you here, and Matt will start us off in our discussion.
Great, thank you. Welcome, Natalia. It's great to see you again. Let me just add two quick comments for those who haven't come to this program before. Our premise is twofold, and it's pretty simple. The first premise is that as historians, we don't talk nearly enough about the creativity involved in the work that we do. And the second premise is that when we do talk about creativity and pull that forward, we learn things about the work that we would miss otherwise. And so that's what these conversations are meant to unpack. Natalia, I'm really curious, and it's become a standard question, but it's always an interesting one. Can you talk a little bit about what it was, whether it was a person you knew or a mentor you had or something that you read that first got you thinking that scholarship, and especially historical scholarship, might be a proper vehicle for your own passions and your own interests? When did you start to think that that was a route you might want to take?
I did a lot of I've always done a lot of volunteer work throughout my life. And in high school, I did a lot of volunteer work, including on political campaigns. So when I went to college, I thought maybe, I'll end up working at City Hall and I'll get a master's. And so somebody told me about a pipeline program. So that'll be the theme of this. Somebody told me about a pipeline program designed to get underrepresented minorities into grad school. And I went to Yale and I studied with Laura Wexler for the summer. And so that's when it kind of changed from being a master's to a PhD. Jonathan Holloway was our grad student TA. And, I think he just had to kind of make sure like we didn't get arrested or something, or he would be the one that bailed. But, Jonathan, he took it very seriously, and he met with those of us who wanted to meet with him every week to discuss our work. And after that, I kind of thought, okay. So then I did another research program at UCLA, and this one was with Brenda Stevenson, and looking at wills and slave records. It was one of these things that really turned me on. And then so I knew I needed to do a research project for grad school for applications, and there wasn't really a seminar at the time. So I went to George Sanchez, who I hadn't met before, and I was going to take his LA history class. And now I realize how extraordinary this is. George was also TAing a section for his LA history class because he wanted to do like an honor section. So he just did it on an overload, just still what he does.
That is what he does.
Yeah, and he said, well, if you don't like the seminars they're offering, why don't you do your own research project? What do you want to do? And so it was all these different avenues between both pipeline programs and professors who just had a love for the field, who let me kind of do my own thing and supported me.
That's great. Can you walk us through a little bit of drawing a line between the moment that you decide to go to grad school and the moment when the project that becomes your first book really begins to take shape? What was the genesis of that project, and how did that come into focus for you? Because it's a project, it stands up very well for one thing, as first books don't always do, but it also, it contains your kind of hallmark of really breaking down some silos and bringing fields together that at the time were not necessarily often done that way. So I'm really curious kind of how that came into focus for you.
So I think it's an example of we don't know what we're writing till we write it, because it's certainly not the way I imagined it. And to Patty's point earlier of like, do you ever want to do this thing that's arcane? my problem is I can't. My problem is I can kind of only do what I want to do. So I was fortunate that at University of Michigan, we had, key people working in American West, Latino Studies. Maria Montoya, Camille Guerin taught there. And so I had taken Latino Studies, kind of American West classes, but in terms of identifying a project, I just couldn't quite get at one. I really wanted the bottom-up community kind of take on it, which is what I had ended up doing for my honors thesis at UCLA. I'd looked at the destruction of the communities from the East LA freeway, looked at all the Edward Roybal papers, and then looked at all the petitions that the residents had. I love those community voices.
Mm-hmm.
And I was very interested in seeing more women in the work, which, in the early 20th century, you don't have it, partly because of demographics. Mexican women weren't immigrating in as great a numbers as men. But I thought, where would you find women? What do they need? And I thought, well, forming community in terms of birthing, in terms of childcare practices, that sort of thing. And so I started looking at that, and I just had no luck. And so then it became that thing, right? Like, well, who would be interested in this story? So then I did the top-down public health kind of version of it, which was not my intention. I really wanted more bottom up, but enough people kind of wrote into the public health department, wrote into the consulate in Mexico, and then using theories of, reading against the grain, there was enough of that. And I wrote the entire dissertation while I was at the Huntington Library. They gave me a small fellowship at the beginning, and I just never left. At that point, you could get a desk, so I kind of claimed it. And when I got there, someone said, I just treat this like a job, and I work here 9 to 5. And that's how I finished my dissertation. She was about ready to leave. And I thought, oh, that sounds like a good model. So I worked on my dissertation 9 to 5 at the Huntington, would waitress in the evening. But when I was writing the dissertation, I remember there would be like Chinese and Japanese that kind of came into the frame. And yet it didn't really fit the dissertation. So I would put it off to the side. And at one point I realized, oh, that's the point.
Right.
That's the point, is that they don't get included in policy. And
Right.
so you have to pull back the picture so that you see the whole frame.
Yes.
You see everyone in the picture.
And that move has become what defines the current generation that's coming up in ethnic studies. But at the time that you did it, it was a very unusual move. Did you have models for it, for how to combine what had generally been these really discrete kind of ethnic histories? How did you kind of find your way through that piece of the project?
I think there were a couple things in terms of personal history and training. So I had started as a gender studies major at UCLA, and I took a lot of classes with Sandra Hale, who is an anthropologist of the Sudan, but in her US studies would kind of do kind of all women of color. I took a lot of classes with Sonia Saldivar-Hall, who is an expert in Chicana feminism, but would do kind of like women of color feminism based on like things like My Bridge Called My Back, that kind of thing. So I think as a gender studies major, I was used to looking at other groups and seeing where certain theories worked and where they didn't, where there was an evenness, where there was an unevenness, where there was just a break in the conversation.
Mm-hmm.
I'd also grown up in a multi-ethnic, multiracial neighborhood, Echo Park in Los Angeles. And, my friends growing up, my best friend was Irish Mexican. My other friends were working class whites, Filipino, Vietnamese refugees, Chinese nationals. And there was a way in which there was a similarity in our experience in growing up in a neighborhood that people kind of were like, ooh, that's a dangerous neighborhood, right? So there was a way in that class united us. But especially as we grew older and went into junior high school, I saw us being tracked differently and different assumptions being made about us by our teachers. So that also let me see like, oh, there are ways in which we're put into these categories that will shape the kinds of options we have available to us. And women's studies, gender studies was the first field that really gave me the language to be able to articulate what that meant.
Mm-hmm.
I have a quick if I could just ask a quick follow-up question.
Yeah, please.
Well, even when our profession is saying this would be a good thing to do, sometimes the person who does it doesn't instantly get celebrated and welcomed. the boundaries and we must try to move across that. Sometimes that does not get instant embrace and applause. And so I'm assuming that there has to have been anxiety in the picture here. As you were saying, I shall go on record as doing what everyone says we must do, which is go across these boundaries and borders. Because you were doing it before. I mean, lots of other people were sticking with the category, saying that. So did you have moments of terror? I'm just going to ask it in a rather overwrought manner, or did you expect to be part of a important wave? Or so what was going on with that, with the interior experience of the creativity?
I think it's a combination of what we mentioned earlier, that kind of, I do what I do and that's what I like to do. So I stick with that, as well as naivete. I still find myself being very naive about things. Like, that's a great, I see things and I think that's a great idea, even, with other people's ideas. At the 1619 project, I was like, that's brilliant. There's pushback on it? Why? It's so smart. Who would have, even with it, and I guess one thing is a public audience, but like even within our profession, there's been so much pushback. So I just think, and it was the same thing with that project. It just, to me, it was just simply the honest way to do it. Once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. I found this, one example of that is it's the story that I opened the book with. The first health officer's report of Los Angeles talks, I mean, it's like exactly what the book is trying to show, the boosterism, Los Angeles, the place of sunshine and how wonderful it is. And it's so healthy, except for that one rotten spot, Chinatown. And, that this is in the late 1880s, 1890s, and people just aren't thinking about Mexican immigrants and Mexican residents at this time in the same way, because it's kind of in that in-between period between, that decline of the Californios, a Mexican population after the US war with Mexico, and then the rise of Mexican immigration with the revolution. And Chinese, even though their population is so small, like they are the other. And so to try to do it otherwise just wouldn't have worked. And I did get a lot of pushback. People didn't want to publish the book. They were happy to publish it if I would have cut out Chinese and Japanese. But it wasn't an authentic move on my part to do it. So
that is really an interesting remark about our profession. So I'm not jumping ahead to this until we start talking more about the next book, but in 2014 with this book, the last paragraph suggests that you think your colleagues still could use some exhortation to cross the boundaries. And it seems funny to read it to you when you're sitting on the screen here, but okay, here we go. Although immigration issues cut across a range of communities and interests, we often fail to perceive these links. And it's nice of you to say we. Oh, okay. When we allow connections to remain hidden, racial scripts are more likely to appear natural, a simple manifestation of, quote, common sense, unquote. Understanding the relational nature of race and exposing the links sustained by the use of racial scripts brings us one step closer to denaturalizing those scripts, and in the process, challenging the dominant narratives and power structures they support. Now, I see that as quite a peppy statement, because it's not saying, since we're very fine professionals and we've got this all figured out, you're saying, can we up our game?
Yeah.
And you're really saying, there's no ambiguity, but you're saying if we continue to fragment and ignore the links, then we reaffirm the existing tales, some of which are quite oppressive. So that's 2014. And you seem to not be positioned to just stand and give a congratulatory speech to how well the profession has done with this. So you just maybe tell the biography of that paragraph, or something, how that paragraph still seemed necessary to write that much later.
Yeah, I think the field's developed the way they did for a reason, right? For very good reason. So in terms of the fields, when I'm talking about like different ethnic studies field around, you know, Latino studies, African-American studies, Native, right? In terms of these histories were never told. It took so much of an effort and social movements to even get them to the fore. And so I understand why that has been the case. But I think, especially if you're at certain places, you know, and I think Michigan was one of these places where I did, you know, my graduate training, that you really are speaking to people across fields all the time. And I think many of us live our lives across fields, right? In terms of how we grew up, in terms of class, in terms of the way that religion makes us feel like outsiders in some ways. You know, we're privileged as professors to, you know, be, to have these jobs and to have a professional title, but then maybe when you are in a meeting, no one listens to you and skips over you because of race, gender, what have you. So there are lots of ways in which you see this. And that was a moment at UCSD where we'd had the Compton cookouts, where, you know, there were these stereotypes of African Americans by these students. And they had found out, and so they, you know, the campus had found out, and so there were protests, and so there were those protests going on, and, you know, they escalated, right? We found a noose at the library, just all the ways in which it really mobilized the campus at this time. And at the same time, in the University of California system, there were tuition hikes that were being proposed. And so people were really feeling like, you know, and we were going through a recession, just like everything was kind of crumbling. And so it was that way in which we needed to understand these things as linked. And, you know, of course, these things don't change overnight. I do think there's been movement so that when we look at the protests after George Floyd's murder, you did start to see people making these connections. So one, there were, you know, all studies and news coverage shows there were so many more white people represented in these movements, right? Black Lives Matter is now just kind of a, you know, a much more accepted term. People started making connections between Black Lives Matter and the immigrant rights movement. Mm-hmm. People started also noticing that Black Latinx immigrants have a much different experience. People started making connections between the police and ICE. You know, so there has been more movement in that way. And then there are still things like I was interviewed for an article recently around the Huntington Library and its diversity efforts. I did not write the story. I was interviewed for the story and I still got hate mail around it, right? And I read the comments for the story and the comments were very much about why do we have to look at the past? It's the past. Get over it. Instead of seeing the ways in which we need to understand the past so that we can see these structural inequalities to move forward. So, you know, it's this conversation that kind of inches along, but at the very least, people need both the theoretical tools and the examples to make it real for them so that they want to make that change.
Right.
And I do want to come back to the creativity. We don't usually think of it as creativity. We think of it as she chose these case studies and explored them. But given the overwhelming number of case studies that you must wake in the night thinking, back off case studies, fewer of you, but your criteria are identified and you have reason for them. So I want to get back to that as really a form of creativity on this, but I also just want to ask, and I'll hand up in a second here, Matt, but okay, so I think that last paragraph that I just read here, there's some humor in that because scholars of immigration are unlikely to be big supporters of strict borders, of formal borders. And yet your paragraph challenges the degree to which they themselves are still observing borders and boundaries. Not the one between Mexico and US in physical terms, but I thought that's pretty funny that these are not the people who you would think would be saying, yes, but build the wall, build the wall, but they have themselves built some of the walls or accepted some of the walls within their own world. So that is funny, and rightly and sensibly, you don't make fun of it in this paragraph. But I just wonder if privately those kinds of moments give you well, that won't be very private if you answer the question now, but do you just think, well, that's pretty funny? And not necessarily the conduct of just scholars who are not as consistent in their principles as they might be, but most of your subjects are very serious. Well, all of your subjects are that, but I just wonder if there are moments where you think, boy, if I got called up to the mic at a stand-up comedy routine, I've got some material here. I mean, some of the stuff, some of the hypocrisy, some of the whatever. So just say whatever you want to say, and say whatever, and don't say what you don't want to say, about how sometimes you just think, heaven's sake, there's just beneath the surface, there's some really ridiculous and hilarious conduct here. What do you think?
I'm not sure if this is where you're going with the question, but this is what the question reminds me of. I mean, I think part of it is it's not just the scholarship, right? We're people, and we talk to certain people, and we're shaped by the people that we talk to. And, you know, we may think of like American West as a field. And yet there's so many, and you may think, right, borderlands, but borderlands means different things to different people. I don't have to tell you, you literally wrote the book on this, right? Chicano studies, borderland, all these things. So I had this moment once at the Western History Association conference. It was maybe like 8 years ago now. It was in San Diego. And, you know, sometimes you look through the program and the titles look really similar, but they're completely different groups of people talking about this topic. Mm-hmm. And so it was this moment of that where there had been a panel, we had done a panel, and I forget the name of the panel now. Maybe let's just say it was like Borderlands. And it was all professors of color and all looking at communities of color. And then the next panel, you know, we left the room, and the next panel coming in was basically the same title. And yeah, I don't remember what their subject matters were, but basically it was all white scholars. Right. So it's also the ways in which right, that's part of what happens. And we see this also in American Studies. You know, Matt was the president of the American Studies Association, and I had the privilege of being the co-chair for his program committee. And you know, you get so many submissions for that conference, and yet a lot of the folks are the panels are panels that kind of sometimes could be almost any, you know, at any conference. It's still their same group. And I would love it if like we could just throw them into like a lottery kind of barrel and then pick them out, like if that's your topic, and get people who haven't talked to each other to talk to one another.
I think that is great. And this session, this has been in all of our sessions, but the creativity, maybe at its core, or one of its cores, it's mixing it up. It's refusing that I shall go speak about the things I already know quite a bit about, and I will not take the risk of having oxygen come to the brain from having a comparison and a contrast and so on. Yeah. So what a most excellent definition of creativity. And, you know, young people, we have graduate students who take part in these things, and they can be the ones organizing sessions that just when people walk into the room, they think, who's that?
Right. Can I get a little more granular on this? And this is a question that I think really bridges your first book and your second book. And it's kind of on the topic of what we've been talking about. When it comes to doing the work of breaking down these barriers and bringing things together in new ways, one piece of that is a narrative challenge. It's like how to learn how to tell a story in a way that it's never been told before. But another piece of it is an archival challenge, because the connections you're trying to make are often connections that the archive itself was meant to conceal rather than reveal. So you're really doing a piece of archival. I think at least Lowe's work is one of the prime examples of this. But you're in bringing different archives together to be in conversation with each other is a very particular kind of research challenge that previous generations didn't really trouble themselves with. And I'm really curious which piece was the most challenging for you, or was it the way that the two together kind of fed each other and spoke to each other? I mean, how did your process work when it came to really facing the toughest challenges of bringing these different materials together in new ways?
That's a great question. That's the question so far that you've asked me that I just want to go like this, like, the narrative challenge, right? I mean, they're both challenging, but I guess they're challenging in different ways. So the archival challenge I'll give you two examples. So for the How Race is Made in America book, that started with at least a foothold, at least a nugget. So while I was researching the Fit to Be Citizens book, as I mentioned, I would find these health reports or different things that I kept putting Chinese and Japanese off to the side. And then the next thing that I wanted to do was to show the connection between Los Angeles and the national level. It's always that thing that if you have a regional study, you want to show its importance. So I wanted to show how LA officials shaped national immigration policy. So I went to the National Archives and looked at their immigration records. And the same thing, and what I did for that, since I had a little bit of limited time and there's no finding aid for the immigration records. For the earlier period, what there are there's 32 microfilm reels of the records. That's just the like index terms.
Right.
And then you have to go look up the actual records if they still have them. And they're not organized in any kind of way of like Latinos, China, Japan. No, they're just organized kind of as at time period as people came through. And so I had looked at Mark Reisler's book. I'm a big proponent of looking at what's been written and looking through people's footnotes. And between Reisler's book and a few others, you have at least some kind of entry point into those archives. And I would pull up the records that he had looked at, and I realized, oh, of course, he wrote this book in the 70s. It's about Mexican immigrants. There's nothing that's relational. But if you look at the records, they're relational.
Right.
I found a couple things that wouldn't fit in my Fit to Be Citizens book, but I thought would make a nice article. And as I went back and did more research, I thought, oh, there's something more here. And so I ended up finding all these discrete case studies that were relational, but there was not kind of a narrative thread that would bring them together. And, I was asked to give a quote for this series, for the kind of social media and the sharing, the advertisement part. And I said something like, what people think of as creativity, I think of as writing, rewriting, sharing. And it was my colleague at UCSD, Luis Alvarez, who read my file for, I think, my promotion. And he was like, oh, wow, I see how you're doing this decade by decade, how it builds, how it does this. And he gave me this whole, and I'm like, yes, that's exactly what I'm doing, right? That way that people make your work sound better than, it is in your head, or show you a little bit of a map. So it was that, and then sharing it with my series editors, George Sanchez and George Lipsitz. And George Lipsitz really hammered home the importance of, of the definition of racial script, so that it carried through with everything. And then some chapters then had to leave. Some chapters ended up getting published separately because in the end, they didn't quite fit. So both having that kind of entree point sharing. And the second story I'll tell you about that is I've gone about it a different way, which is at one point, maybe it was between the first and second book, I turned in, I was like, I have more time. I'm gonna subscribe to the New York Times print edition, and I'm gonna read the paper every day. And I remember it was at the time that we were trying to pass immigration reform, the Gang of Eight, I think it was at that point, and the Affordable Care Act, and trying to get people to sign up for the Affordable Care Act. And Latinx were not signing up for the Affordable Care Act. And these articles would run side by side. Immigrants are terrible. Why won't immigrants trust us? And children of immigrants trust us and sign up for the Affordable Care Act. And so I was really interested in how we disenfranchise, marginalize not just immigrants, but also their descendants, so that they don't feel like they're safe signing up for these kinds of things. So I started looking at birthright citizenship. I thought I'd go back to like the early 90s with the passage of Prop 187 in California in 1994. And as I did the research, I kept going further back and further back and further back until I went to the 1930s and found these cases of children, Mexican American children, who basically, when they needed any kind of aid, to help with their tuberculosis, if they got really sick, if they died and their parents asked that the county help bury them, they came under the attention of the state and they were deported. So they're like the anti-anchor babies. They're the ones who help make their parents deport. Obviously not blaming them, but it was because their parents sought aid for them that the family was deported.
Great, thank you. As predicted, we're going to have a time management problem, but let me throw it back to Patty to help spirit us along.
Okay, oh boy, if I'm the one who's going to make things move faster, that's something to think about here. But so I have a thing that I just went by the first time I was looking at your website, and I just have to, it's not a pause and it's not a diversion, but we're going to get on fast to our program. But you are certified as a mediator, it says on your website. I thought, well, that totally makes sense, but explain that. That's just a wonderful thing to find there.
I am interested in what I'm interested in, and you just can't move me. So I'm interested in listening to people. I'm interested in why these ideas, like you're saying, oh, racial scripts, why can't you go make that congratulatory remark? I'm interested in what people need to know to listen to one another, whether it be about race or ethnicity. I did admin for a long time, and for admin, if you want to make any move around diversity issues, I mean, people come into the room with their arms crossed. People don't even return your emails when you ask them, invite them to a meeting around diversity. And so I just wanted to know how to get people to listen to one another better. My husband's a trained mediator. There's a program called the National Mediation, I even forget, National Center for Mediation, and they do trainings. You can invite them to your campus. UCSD did that. And so I thought, why not? And I would say that for my training in admin, and if you're an admin, you go through different trainings, senior administrative training, how to fundraise, all these different things. The two best things that I learned, the two best trainings that I did were mediation and meditation. And basically, because they both help you listen first. Because if you don't know where people are coming from, where do you know where to meet them? And that's very much the case around race and ethnicity, whether we're talking about scholarship or how to change their programs on campus. We had, I think, 6 different divisions at UCSD. And when I was the Associate Vice Chancellor for Diversity, I went and met with every division because we have this great program that brings free postdocs to campus, right? The President's Postdoc Program, and not everybody would take advantage of it. And people just assumed, oh, they don't want to hire around race and ethnicity. They're resistant. There was some of that. But as I went and listened to everybody, I realized, oh, the funding works differently in STEM. So we need to change this about this. Oh, this works differently in the business school. We need to change this. So yeah, I just think if we want people to read our work, we need to know what they're hung up on. So we need to know how to listen. And the mediation is so much about that.
It's so consonant and congruent with what you do as an historian. It's really quite spectacular how that can be done with living human beings and passed away human beings, and done pretty much kind of in the same spirit of, well, spirit, now I'm talking about passed away people and referring to spirit. So so maybe Matt wants to come in for a second.
No, I'm really curious about how direct your experience is of possessing the skills that you mobilize in your mediation work and the skills that you mobilize in the archive. I'm thinking of a conversation I had with Farah Griffin. We were talking about Harlem Nocturne, and she said, I went into it with one set of ideas, but the sources kept telling me that 1943 was where I really wanted to be. But it was all about kind of listening to what the sources were telling her. And I wonder if that's kind of the way you work yourself, and how you understand the relationship between mediation and that kind of historical work.
Yes, I think that absolutely, as well as the conclusions I draw. And so I'll give you 2 examples. When I was writing my dissertation, my husband would often read it for me. He's a great editor, would just make sure it was legible before I sent it to my committee members. And at one point I said something like, see, this person was, their ideas were driven by racism, or their ideas about race. And he was like, how do you know they're not just stupid? How do you know they just don't make bad choices? I'm like, fair question. I need to unpack that and show all the steps of how I make my conclusions. This I've kind of moved past, but I still have it. I've now started this new project on the workers that built the Huntington. I was asked to do some consulting work for them for their 1919 exhibit, and they showed us a payroll sheet. And as a consultant, it's great because you go in and you're like, you're doing this wrong. You should do this. You should think about that. And then I got asked to do a talk for the 1919 exhibit. And I wanted to use that payroll sheet because I had Mexican laborers on it. And I wanted to at least talk a little bit about that. And then when I wrote about it, I shared it with my personal editor, wanted to get the talk as smooth as possible before I presented it. It was the first time I'm presenting it, and it's like this huge venue. And I talked about how, after their names, there was the letter M. And I said, see, they segregated the workforce. I mean, you could tell also by the last names, but still there was the letter M. And I said that the letter M signified that it was M for Mexican, the Mexican workers. And she said, how do you know it doesn't mean Monday? Maybe they all start, those are the workers that start on Monday. I think there's enough evidence now I've researched far enough that I can safely claim, or I know enough as a writer, to get back to your question about narrative, that I can say, while we do not know, all these evidence data points point to that means Mexican. So I think it's listening to the archives, sharing with people, seeing what they hear, and then saying, oh, it's because I had left that stuff behind. I need to put on the table and explain to you why. And once you explain to them, even if you disagree, I find even if people disagree with me, at least they know how I got there and they know why we're disagreeing.
Yeah. So I want to get out of order. I guess we really must return and talk about the racial scripts thing, because we want to give a shout out to he's not with us today, I guess, on the attendees, but Ernie Chavez, I guess, was the one who said, go with the term racial scripts. So I want to make sure we get back to that very fast, but I just think I'm not sure if it's humor again, but the fact that you are now working on a book on the Huntington Library's gardens, and you were looking at the workers who made those gardens happen. The Huntington Library is one of the 3 or 4 greatest archives on Western American history. All kinds of important works in Western American history have come from there. Many scholars have strolled in the gardens. Yeah, there's something just so striking about the fact that you are now writing about the gardens that all the scholars strolled in. And I have strolled in those gardens and thought, what a fascinating plant, many times. But it never occurred to me to say, well, this didn't just happen. That's a lot of work. And the horrors of putting in a cactus garden, I don't even want to think about what that would mean for the laborers doing that. But now you've given a talk at the Huntington Library, and you're writing a book about the physical place where all that research got done. And many of the scholars, I'm sure, were writing in a condemnatory way about people who didn't think about the work that had produced, whether they were writing historical figures, writing on railroads or whatever. They were not thinking about the workers who made that happen. But then they have been strolling around these gardens, and now you're saying, look at the gardens, look at the gardens. And so I see humor in that. Maybe I shouldn't. And maybe it's such a, I don't know. So just talk to us about, let's call it irony, or call it, why don't you call it whatever you call it? What is that like? What a remarkable thing for a scholar, a creative scholar, to be doing. So you told us a little bit about how that got started, but the fact that you persisted and are now doing it as a major research project. Talk about how you see that as and is it irony? What is it?
I was very blessed to have a dad who was a great critical thinker. He only had an 8th grade education, but just one of the sharpest minds, great critical thinking. And when I was a graduate student at the Huntington, and I had that fellowship at the Huntington Library, I invited him to come have lunch with me. And you often are, and especially back then, I mean, I'm talking, over 20 years ago, I was often the, only person of color, definitely the only Latina for spells at a time. And, it was rare enough at that time to have scholars of color at the Huntington that if there was a scholar of color, I would go up and introduce myself. I still do that a little, but I realize people often think like, that's weird. But, that's how I met Danny Widener, who became my colleague at UCSD. I just went up to him and said, oh, you're Black, I'm Latina, we're at the Huntington. I bet we can trace, I'm not kidding you. This is how weird I am. I bet we can trace this in 6 degrees of separation. He said, well, my advisor is Robin Kelly. And I said, well, my advisor is George Sanchez. We're like 1 degree, right? I mean, like that's how small academic worlds can be. And so when my dad came to have lunch with me, he talked about how beautiful the gardens were. And, and I'm like, yeah, but it's also, it can be a very uncomfortable place. And he's like, well, just remember, we built it. And that just stayed with me, and I thought I would love to have some way to trace it. But I knew the Western collections pretty well from researching them for my first book. And so I didn't think that could be something that could be traced. And I'm very grateful to the curators of the 1919 exhibit, especially Jenny Watts, who invited me to be part of that team. And I think that shows, right? Like it was helpful for my project, but it was also curators that said, we've got one perspective. We need a team of people to come in. They also invited Linnell George, right? Like, who'd done African-American history in Los Angeles. Like, how will this look differently to people who haven't worked on, who aren't looking at it through the lens of kind of Huntington scholars?
Right. That's lovely. That's really excellent. And now I think our audience should hear a word or two, or several, whole bunch of words about the word script here, the racial script. And I will just say, oh, hi, audience. That word works really well in this book. And now the person who made it work so well is going to talk about how that word came into the center stage of this. But also, she is going to deal with my irrepressible physiological cheer that has me continually thinking with that, okay, it's really clear. She's made it. We know it's a script. We know that it did not exist. There was a long time when a certain configuration of ideas about Mexicans did not exist. We know that it came into being, that it was a script. Human beings did that. Human beings could change it. So, but then, boo-hoo, you're also very good about explaining how scripts last past their point of origin. So just as you see, this is over the script. We rewrite scripts. People do that all the time. And then you bring me back with they persist, they linger. So anything you would like to go at in that? Just, you can take the part where you disillusion me. That can be very short. You can make that really short. When you say, actually, these scripts really have tensile strength that persists. But how did that become so effectively a concept, tool, structure, framework, whatever the word might be?
So I think again, this is a great hopefully encouragement to people listening who feel like they always should be working. I mean, I get my best ideas when I'm not working. So it's being out and about in the world. So I was at a party, and a Latino person who is a very nice person, told a joke about African Americans. And there were no African Americans at this party. It was, mainly Latinos. And I just always wonder, like, why, I never understood why people of color tell jokes about other people of color. People always think it's like this, like, white people of color divide, but within people of color, of course, and even within the same, groups, there can be divides around country of origin, generation, class, whatever that may be. And I thought, you can tell that same joke, and instead of having Latinos or African Americans, you could have Latinos as the punchline. Yeah. So, and I'm sure we've heard it that way. So I just thought, like, why would you do that? Yeah. How can I convince? What is the point of writing the Fit to Be Citizens book if I can't communicate with somebody in my own community why they shouldn't be telling this joke? Mm-hmm. And so the racial scripts idea is sort of born of that. Like, there are these structures and they can be applied to other groups. And of course, things aren't this kind of one-to-one relationship. And so there's lots of reasons why people's experience, language, skin color, religion, region, time period, and all that will shape it. And so it might look differently, but there's still a similarity there. And so that was kind of the idea for doing it. And then, I was at a conference, and again, just not in the panel, although panels are good to go to at conferences, but at the bar, and I told somebody what I was working. I told Ernie what I was working on, and again, why you should share your work. And Ernie's like, Ernie's like me, he's from LA. We think Hollywood is like, it's like a script. I'm like, yeah, it's script around race. And eventually that turned into a racial script. I think what's hard about it, I mean, so one, yes, it hasn't changed things automatically, but at least, you see that movement. People are aware of this. And I will keep hammering it home. And what I really appreciated your question, I really appreciate that question, because it's like, yes, why hasn't it taken hold? What would you need? And so now I've already been working on a piece on Black Lives Matter and immigrant rights, and where we see things coming together and where they still are apart. Because that is something I've been thinking about post George Floyd. The moment that to me it showed like, we still have so much work to do is, everybody was protesting in the streets this summer. Everybody was down. And then in Los Angeles, we had an election. And it was for one of the propositions was for rent control. It had already failed at the state level. And so now they were just trying to do it at the LA County level, and it failed, and I just was like, okay, Black Lives Matter, immigrant rights, but yet, and we don't have an affordable care, all these ways in which people's lives are disseminated through their lived reality of wages and healthcare and not having access to childcare and the work that people had to do during the pandemic. And yet when we offer them one kind of safety net of rent control in a city where you can't buy a house, unless you're willing to pay over $1 million, then that's what fails. So to me, it was like the way in which we need to make these scripts visible, the ways in which we need to make these policies visible, the way in which we need to make the longevity of these policies visible, that there's still that work to do as much as those movements were coming together. So one, people were seeing the common cause in racial scripts, but the policy side is often where people fail to see how race is made.
Well, all righty. I have the last 2.5 minutes, 2.5 minutes I'm reserving for a question. So that gives you at least 4 minutes or so.
I'll take 4 minutes. Well, no, so Natalia, I'm wondering then, do you think that this model of thinking about scripts, do you see that as a generative way of thinking about white nationalism as well? I'm thinking about January 6th as in some really important sense a scripted event. It's scripted in the sense of entitlement that was enacted by the mob, but scripted also in the ways that the danger of the mob was so misread. Is script the tool that we need to think about that, or would you approach it a different way?
I think that a couple things. That one, it just shows again why we need to be in conversation with different people. So Kathleen Ballou and Ramon Gutierrez are having a new edited volume come out from UC Press within 6 or 8 months or something, called The Field Guide to White Supremacy. And it came out of a conference that they did out at the University of Chicago, which I attended, and just thought it was one of the best conferences I've been to, because there were people I don't usually talk to. So it was people studying white supremacy, people doing eugenics, people doing border issues, and all of us talking together in ways that we saw the intersections of these conversations and ways in which it was distinct. So there's that I think it's a tool you can use, but not the only tool. You need to see how it works. Two, I thought, well, for me, as someone who watched those events in the aftermath, what I thought was so interesting was, again, how invisible scripts are, how invisible the structure is. So one of the chants that really got me as you saw the writers go into the Capitol building was they said, I've never been here before. No, this is our house. We need to, and I'm like, whose house did you think it was? So all the ways in which that had been made invisible. The other scene that got me was seeing all the workers, mainly people of color, mainly African Americans, cleaning up after the rioters. Yeah. And the long history of how one, that it was African Americans, sometimes slaves, who had helped build the Capitol building. Two, that there had been a moment after Reconstruction in which once the scaffolding, the structure of oppression had been lightened for those groups, that they could get advancements, that they were doing white collar work in the Capitol building. And it was with President Wilson coming in and taking those things away, and at that moment instituting segregated bathrooms. So it's that way in which we need to always go back to the cultural narratives that let people think like, we're taking back our house.
Right.
And the studying of the structural policies that made that invisibility possible.
Yeah.
You have another minute, Matt. You have a
I
minute.
yield my minute. You can reclaim your time.
That allows us to have a more open-ended last minute for Natalia. So Natalia, you and I both weep occasionally as we are in historical discussions, and a couple of times in this series I've done that. And this time, your father having lunch at the Huntington and saying, "We built this." Well, okay. You have in a couple of different public record sources, and one in the book, maybe both in the book. Anyway, you have stories about weeping in archives. You have the story of weeping in the archive about 20 people dying, and you have a story about Los Angeles International Airport and the lights. And so, would you tell those stories? And in kind of a framework of the historians have every right to tear up, and it may be crucial to the whole creativity project. Maybe, I don't know, because there are many creative historians who don't cry all the time. So we'll give them their right to be who they are. But it's not the worst route to breaking out from some of the familiar predicted, this is how a professional academic researcher conducts himself or herself. So could you tell those two stories?
Sure. The first story was doing research for the Fit to be Citizens book. And, people wanted to know, but how did Mexicans feel about these policies? And it was so hard to find those records. And finally, I was able to go to Mexico City and look in the consulate records. And in those consulate records, you have people saying like, my parent died and I can't afford to bring them back. Can you help me bring their body back? All the ways in which their labor was and their sacrifices were erased. And then this one document of women who were crossing daily from Juarez to El Paso, and they would have to get fumigated, to show that they were not carrying disease. And then the local prison that had adopted these practices. And one day, somebody lit a match, and with all the formaldehyde on the clothes, they, went up into flames, and everybody there died. And it was like, the work is already such indignity, and then for it to cause them to lose their lives, it was too much. And then I'm looking at the time, fast forward to today, when we're still talking about how can you be an undocumented if you're an essential worker, and living in California and going through the wildfires and just being so safe in my home, and knowing that if I just went to walk my dog, I was choking on smoke and I was not in a hazardous zone, and thinking that there were people still doing agricultural labor during this time. And yet we didn't acknowledge those voices and their names and their experience. And it was the mayor of LA, Eric Garcetti, who in one of his news conferences finally said someone's name, finally said the name of this man Barona at LAX, a Latinx worker, a Central American who had passed from COVID, and we honored him. And it just felt like these moments were separated by 100-year time span, and yet the dynamics that made them possible were still in place.
We are out of time, and yet if you have something you would like to say in the last minute, we'll be moving over to the discussion group. Anyone who'd like to join us will join us there. There's a nice question from someone who wants to have your guidance on a young person working on Oklahoma public health, so we'll move over to that soon. But if there's anything that you would like to say as a closing remark, I know we would benefit from that.
I think just my closing remark is that I was fortunate to be able to work from home, as a professor during the pandemic. And by not traveling, I was fortunate, and my son's older, so I was, I didn't have to worry about childcare. I was able to, get some work done. But I feel like now that I'm interacting with people in person and, in this kind of conversation, this is what leads to creativity. It's the exchange. It's the getting ideas from how people phrase things. It's the people pushing you on your ideas. How is that a helpful concept? How is it not? What are the,
Right.
I've gotten more out of these 2 months that I've left my house than I have, just, we need to talk to one another. It's the best formula for creativity. Thank you for inviting me.
Oh,
Thank you so much.
thank you. And again, this is my ridiculous episode where I always say, were we in person, this is the occasion, this is where we would all be doing the standing ovation of Southern American West. And if we stand up, you get to see more of my beaded vest. That would be all that we would get. So the standing ovation for all the attendees who cannot see, who I know join me in this moment. And we'll see.
And then, yes, so for audience members, go to the Q&A, and there's a question that was queued up by Brian Bishop, and the answer is the link to the Zoom meeting, which will commence in about a minute.